titled Is Brexit Inevitable? My name is Agata Gostyńska-Jakubowska and I have a pleasure to chair this discussion. The event will be on the record and it is being live streamed. We also encourage you to tweet away, to tweet your thoughts from this event by using hashtag Is Brexit Inevitable, and ideally adding also our CER's Twitter handle. I have three excellent speakers today with me, and I will start from Lord Kerr, who is crossbench member of the House of Lords and also chair of the CER board. Lord Kerr, as you know, is one of the architects of the Article 50, so he knows all ins and outs of the process. He also offered one of the Lords' amendments to the withdrawal bill, which urged the government to negotiate a customs union with the EU. We have Hugo Dixon with us, who is a journalist, entrepreneur, and campaigner. Hugo is also chairman of InFacts, which you probably all know well. He's also co-founder of Common Ground, and he is author of the in-out question, why Britain should stay in the EU and try to make it better. And last but not least, we have Charles Grant, who is director of the CER. Charles is definitely a man to talk to about the latest developments in Brexit talks. Charles has also just published his op-ed in FT, where he predicts that the government is going to ask the EU to remain in the single market for goods, but he also predicts that the EU is going to say no. Well, if you haven't read that yet, I strongly encourage you to do that. We were also expecting Anna Soubry, a Tory MP, to join us today, but as you can imagine, she has other duties. As the withdrawal bill has now returned to the Commons, as she's there and she's going to fight for the meaningful vote for Parliament. Now, before I give the floor to our panelists, let me very briefly, and I promise I will be brief, set the stage for our discussion. We are 2 years after the referendum and 9 months before UK's formal departure from the EU. But the latest joint report on the progress of the negotiations, which was issued yesterday actually by Mr. Barnier's team, well, only confirms that we are still far away from finalizing negotiations on the withdrawal agreement. As you know, it won't be any surprise to you, Northern Ireland is one of the most toxic issues in the negotiations, which could still derail the talks. This is notwithstanding that also both parties haven't actually started substantial negotiations about the future relationship, about the political declaration, which is supposed to be attached to the withdrawal agreement. And at the same time, at home, the British government is facing equally difficult ride. As we speak, the Commons is debating whether Westminster should have a greater role over the outcome of the Brexit negotiations. We know that Brexiteers have called the meaningful vote an attempt to stop Brexit, whereas others say that this is simply an insurance policy just in case the government decides to drive the UK off the cliff edge if there is no agreement on the card. So, on this note, I will turn to Lord Kerr. John, could you elaborate, please, on Parliament's role in the process, or in other words, what is now on Westminster's mind?
Thank you. I can't remember a time of such uncertainty and volatility. I remember about three and a half weeks in 1976 when it was not clear what the government policy was. It was not clear what the cabinet could unite on. It was not clear that Parliament would agree. But that was only about three and a half weeks. And Callaghan pulled it together, and we went to the IMF, and due course we adopted an austerity program. And the government lived on for another couple of years. The present situation is, I think, unprecedented in my lifetime, where the cabinet cannot apparently agree amongst itself. There are clearly many more Philip Lees lurking in the party. The Parliament contains a majority of people in both houses who don't like the direction of travel, though it's inevitable that one has to go that way. And as I said, the report to the European Council next week is of very little progress in the actual negotiation between the UK and the EU. So trying to predict what will happen is almost uniquely difficult, I think. And I don't even want to predict what will happen this afternoon in the House of Commons. I think that trying to predict where we will be in 9 months' time is really very difficult. Parliament will have a meaningful vote, whatever happens this afternoon in the House of Commons. There will have to be the withdrawal implementation bill. There is already the original Green amendment to the bill before it came to the House of Lords. Moreover, it is actually unthinkable that if one approached, say, the cliff edge, or a really very bad deal, that the House of Commons would not have a vote. The House of Commons, remember Narvik. Narvik was a botched job too, and the Chamberlain fell over a procedural motion in the House of Commons. So there will be a meaningful vote. And you could say that today is a bit of a sham battle. What will the real battle be? The real battle, I don't know when it will come. It could come as early as November. Bits of it will come ahead of for example, the Customs Union Amendment, which I am sorry to see the House of Commons knock out. It will be back in one form or another on the trade bill, which will apparently start come out of hibernation in the House of Commons at some stage in July. And there is absolutely no doubt that the Customs Union issue will be raised in that context. But the real battle will come in November or December or January or at the latest February. And I see 7 possible scenarios. It is becoming more likely that there will be no deal at all. I think the warning paper from the Commission for the European Council is correct. I think that the lack of progress, particularly on the Irish issue and the backstop and so on, I think that could derail the whole show and mean that there was no transition period, and mean, presumably, that the government would have difficulty persuading the backbenchers that we should pay the bill, that we have agreed on the bill, and the bill is the cost of the past, not the cost of the future. But if we don't agree with the bill, if we leave, as Mr. Rees-Mogg would like, without paying, we do a runner, it follows that there will be a long period before we establish a future relationship with the European Union, because we will be a defaulter state and there will be legal proceedings somewhere, presumably in Amsterdam or The Hague. And that of course means that we would not be able to do deals around the world as well, because our future trade partners around the world would be inclined to think that they needed to know what was our relationship with the European Union before they did a deal. How big is the market in which they were obtaining access? So I think the risk of no deal is rising very high. I think the risk of Parliament approving no deal, or there not being a vote in Parliament on a no deal cliff edge, is infinitesimally small. So that is scenario 1, a parliamentary crisis brought about because the cliff edge is getting very close. And I think it will by then be very clear to the country at large that in all sorts of areas, research, universities, travel, business, supply chains, exporting, it will be very clear that the cliff edge will be a complete disaster. The second scenario, and this is probably the likeliest scenario, there is a deal and it is approved by Parliament. There is a deal because we go on negotiating by surrender. And the deal is largely on the lines that have been laid down by the 27th, and we settle for, at least for the interim period, possibly extendable, we settle for being in a customs union, though non-voting members, and behaving as if we were still members of the single market, promising undertaking to do so, and so avoid the hard border in Ireland. That seems to me to be probably still the most likely, but only just. Option 3, well, I would rule out the House of Commons agreeing to no deal. Option 4, House of Commons rules against no deal and asks the government to carry on negotiating. Option 5, a government that can't deliver on its principal policy objective usually falls. Is usually, or it seeks a parliament more receptive to its views than the present one. So option 5, general election. I think the possibility of the general election next winter is now rising quite fast. Option 6, my preferred option, of course. We take back the Article 50 letter. This is the prodigal son option. We know that it will be warmly welcomed by the 27th. It's a highly implausible option without option 7, which is a people's vote. It seems to me it is possible to envisage a combination of election, people's vote, withdrawal of articles. But of my scenarios, 4 of them require an extension. It is not possible for us to, well, it would be very unlikely that we could have an election and a new government or Mrs. May back in power without seeking an extension. The other 3 certainly would need an extension before. So it seems to me that one thing that our friends across Europe should be thinking about is, well, 2 things they should think about. One, the situation in Britain is extraordinarily volatile. It is very hard to predict what is going to happen. And 2, there are quite plausible scenarios which would entail the British asking for the unanimous agreement of the 27 for an extension beyond the date we rashly picked ourselves without any clear rationale, 29 March 2019. So these are the 2 general models, well, 3. 1, there will be a meaningful vote, whatever happens today. 2, God knows what will happen then. 3, but it could entail asking for an extension.
Thank you very much, John. Can I immediately turn to Hugo, because it seems to me that out of all those 7 scenarios, the last one is something which is the most appealing to you. That's at least what I gather, people's vote. Could you perhaps tell us what the public makes of all this mess? Did British people, vote really for the deal that Theresa May is planning to deliver them? And do you think there can be an interesting dynamics here, and there can be some shifts happening soon?
Yes, well, Agatha, lovely to be here, and lovely to be here, Charles. Well, in addition to chairing InFacts, I'm also a founding member of the People's Vote campaign. So the key message, in terms of, follow on from what John said, Brexit is not a done deal, and it won't be until March the 29th of next year. The most realistic path to stop it is to get a people's vote and win a people's vote. Now, if the government had a viable plan, we would have no chance. But I think most of you have probably realised that the government doesn't have a plan. Tension in the cabinet is at boiling point. It can't agree what it wants, let alone something that the EU would agree to, and the negotiations, as you yourself mentioned, Agatha, aren't going terribly. Negotiation by surrender. Capitulation after capitulation after capitulation. Tony Blair had something that sounded a bit like that, but was much nicer. Public opinion. Well, the main thing about public opinion is people are sick and tired of the whole goddamn business. So that is not good for our cause. principles. But there are three things that are good. People know that Brexit is going badly. If you ask them, do they want a vote on the final deal, it's almost 2-to-1 want it when you strip out the don't knows. And more people are concluding that Brexit was a bad idea. For the first 9 months after the referendum, it was stuck. If you ask them, YouGov asks this every month, it was stuck. 52-48 virtually didn't move for 9 months. And then in the spring of last year, it started to shift, as she called that unfortunate for her election. And by the autumn of last year, it was about 52-48 in our favour. Not huge, I admit. And then it remained stuck for about 6 months. And the last couple of months, it started to shift a little bit more in our favour. And the latest YouGov tracker shows a 7-point lead in our favour. That is not enough for the people's vote to win. And it's not enough. We need something much more decisive than that. But things are shifting in our direction. So what will happen? Well, I'm not going to go over John's scenarios, but I do think that, just suffice it to say that I think that the most likely outcome still is that Theresa May limps on and does a deal. And I actually think that the deal probably will be a bit like the one that Charles wrote about in the FT today. It's as he described it, it was free movement in goods, but not services for people. As you know, 80% of our economy is services, so that's not very good for our economy, but it would still involve us following the rules of almost the entire single market, certainly for goods, but also for things that cut across sectors, such as competition policy, VAT, possibly even tax, anything that would be designed to stop us dumping, and I think would involve us paying into the budget. This is known as a technical jargon because it's customs union and regulatory alignment. It's known as a customs and regulatory alignment period. CRAP. And it is true to its name. So our hope is, and what we're pushing for, is that if that's the scenario, MPs will look at it. I agree with John that they won't say cancel Brexit. We've gone into the cul-de-sac of a referendum 2 years ago. The only realistic way out of a cul-de-sac is the way you went in. We need a people's vote. And what's the case for it? It's like buying a house. It's a wonderful house. You put in an offer, you get the survey, it shows the roof's falling in, there's dry rot, there's subsidence, and a developer's building a 6-storey office next to you that's going to block the view and the sunlight. You can go ahead if you want to, but you don't have to. And the same thing is with Brexit. There are a lot of new facts that we didn't know about 2 years ago. We've gone from the fastest to the slowest G7 country, and that's even before Brexit's happened. The 2 Leave campaigns have cheated in the referendum. A Russian spy was poisoned in Salisbury. Donald Trump is in the White House. We did not know that. Hardly anybody believed that that was going to happen 2 years ago. That he was going to question NATO, that he was going to try and tear up the climate and change pact and the Iran nuclear deal. That he was going to launch trade wars. I mean, we didn't know all of that. Is this really the time for us to be burning our bridges with Europe to suck up to Trump's America? So these are new facts, and this is the case. Now, and the biggest new fact will of course be that deal, whatever that deal is, we'll know. But it's not a rerun, and this is important, it is not a rerun of the referendum, because last time it was a choice between the reality of imperfect, we all know that the EU is not perfect, and the fantasy of out, which the fantasists of the Brexit campaign were able to say, you know, Boris's cake and eat it. After there is a deal on the table, it will be a comparison between the reality of in and the reality of out, which will not be the land flowing with milk and honey. So how do we get it? You asked me also to say a few things about Labour. Well, in fact, to get this people's vote, we first of all need Parliament to give us a people's vote. And in practice, we need the Labour Party, the rest of the opposition, plus at least 10 Tories. Labour is not there yet, but there is movement in the Labour Party. Key blocs are concerned, trade unions are concerned that Brexit is going to damage workers' rights. Young people, who are big supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, they back a people's vote by 3-1 when you strip out the don't knows. And Labour supporters, who are worried that Brexit could lead to yet more years of austerity, are backing a people's vote by 4-1 when you strip out the don't knows. So again, you have to think, which way is Corbyn going to go? Now he's not there yet, but he's already shifting, and both Keir Starmer and John McDonnell have said recently words to the effect like, we are keeping our options open on a people's vote. So that's not yet good enough, but they're moving. Tories, I think we don't need the whole of the Tory party. As I say, we need at least 10, maybe 20, when the crunch that John talks about comes. What are the hot button issues for them? Well, I think there are two really hot button issues. One is they think of themselves as the party of business. And they know, at least some of them know, that if they go ahead with a bad Brexit, and any Brexit is going to be bad, that will be bad for the economy and could destroy their reputation for being the party that can manage the economy. The second hot button issue is that some Tories really do care about our United Kingdom, and they know that Brexit can destabilise Northern Ireland and potentially lead to another independence referendum in Scotland. So we've got chances, we're fighting, we're not just passively there. We've created this new campaign of People's Vote. It brings together 9 pro-European organisations, a cross-party group of MPs. We're getting out more and more endorsements, nurses, midwives, some trade unionists, student leaders who represent 1 million students, and we've got more endorsements in the pipeline. And this is what we are fighting for as we build up to that crunch, sometime probably towards the end of the year. So Brexit is not inevitable.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Now I will turn to Charles. So, Charles, is Brexit inevitable? Do you think the UK will leave the EU on the 29th March of 2019? Will you pour some cold water on Hugo, or are you going to keep his hopes up?
Right, well, I'm the party pooper. I'm the token Eurosceptic today. I want to say thank you to Hugo for actually suggesting that we hold this meeting. It was Hugo's idea. It was a very good idea, but we were rather lucky with the timing, except for losing Anna. I don't see really how Brexit can be stopped. I hope I'm wrong, and if John and Hugo are right, that it can be stopped, I'm the happiest man in the world. My basic thesis is that public opinion is not moving significantly. I accept Hugo, it's moved a little bit, but I think, as you yourself acknowledged, Hugo, it's got to move quite a bit more before stopping it becomes viable. The Tory party, I think, is not going to promise a referendum. It's hard to see circumstances in which a Tory leader or a Tory Prime Minister would offer a referendum, because the Tory party is so hostile to the concept of being in the EU, any referendum could reverse that decision, and nobody who was a Tory leader who promised that would survive very long in the Tory party. It's in the DNA of the Tory party to keep Brexit, and even those like Mrs May who were against Brexit, I think, feel that they have to see it through, and would. Quite a lot of her rather more pro-Remain ministers than her actually do want to see it through and do not want to stop it. So I think you have to respect the will of the people and keep the Tory party together. So the Tory party only has a future as a party that delivers Brexit. And if Mrs May falls, any other leader who becomes leader will have to face that reality. And I don't see why her falling would lead to an election, John. I think the Tory party doesn't want an election. I think Mr Corbyn might do quite well. They'd rather just stay in office and hope something turns up and go on relying on the DUP, I think. So I'm not sure that losing the substantive vote leads to an election. I'll say a little bit more about Labour, but I defer to Douglas Alexander, who will undoubtedly say more in a minute and correct me for my analysis. But I do think that in order to get a referendum, because of the Tories being what they are, you need to get Labour delivering a referendum. And I agree, it is conceivable that could be an election, it's conceivable Labour could win, and then there could be a referendum. But I don't see Labour promising a referendum at the moment. Basically, the one reason is simply Corbyn himself and some of his closest advisors are lifelong Eurosceptics. They believe that EU membership, and particularly single market membership, makes socialism in one country impossible. They think that EU rules on public procurement, state aid and competition would be prevent the Labour Party introducing its programme. And so they're quite happy with Brexit, happy or at least relaxed about it. But the other reason is what Labour MPs think. And again, I've only having spoken to a few recently, I may have got it wrong, it seems to me that the Labour MPs with big Remainer majorities like Chuka and Kerr are quite relaxed about trying to stop, well actually they could be relaxed about trying to stop Brexit. But the trouble is that, because their constituencies are strongly Remainer, the trouble is that a lot of the Labour MPs with very small majorities happen to be in the North and the Midlands in constituencies that voted for Leave. So they are very reluctant to take a course of action which could be portrayed as trying to retain free movement of people in the single market or indeed stop Brexit. I don't see, I think the Labour Party has always been a little bit of a pantomime horse with two heads, the kind of metropolitan, urban, liberal, middle-class Labour members and the more working-class people from the south of Wales, the Midlands and the north. They've been tied together for 100 years, and they're still tied together, but the issue of free movement of people has put a kind of knife down the middle of the horse, and it's harder and harder to keep the two halves together, in my view. Why is public opinion not shifting? Well, the trouble is the economy is doing too well, but I would just flag up something the CR is going to publish on Saturday by my colleague John Springford, looking at the cost to the economy of leaving the EU. He's done some quite original number crunching and concludes that it's a 2.1%, the GDP is 2.1% smaller than it would otherwise have been, and the cost of the exchequer from that is a bit over £20 billion, I think. I just say that in parentheses. And although the economy is sliding down gradually, it's not as yet having a big impact on public opinion. Let me finish by saying why I think public opinion might move in the wrong direction, meaning towards supporting Brexit. I hope I'm wrong, of course, but I thought immediately after the referendum that public opinion was bound to move in the right direction because people would see they'd been silly billies and voted the wrong way and Britain was suffering as a result and they would regret the foolishness of their vote. But the Swiss diplomat said to me shortly after the referendum, don't count on it. When we voted against the EEA in 1992, support for EU membership in Switzerland was 45%. Now it's 12%. Why? Because for the last 25 years, Switzerland's been in a permanent negotiation with the EU, a negotiation in which the EU holds all the cards and it behaves like a bully, at least is perceived like a bully by the Swiss people. So the Swiss have got more and more unhappy about the way they're treated, and support for EU membership in Switzerland is now negligible. And that is at least a possibility for the UK too. I have myself met Remain voters who, in the last few months, who've told me that they would vote Leave in a second referendum because they don't like being bullied by the EU. And there is just enough truth in that narrative to make it quite a powerful one. I recently met the leader of one political party, quite a big one, in the Netherlands, who said to me, the EU has got to remember the lessons of Versailles. If you hold all the cards in a negotiation, don't humiliate the party that holds no cards. You're going to impose the deal on that party anyway, so give them a few tokens and pretend you're not imposing a deal on them. And I'm not sure everyone on the EU side has learned the lesson of Versailles. And I think the way the EU is behaving on Galileo, on justice and affairs, is not helpful in that respect. And also, if I'm right in today's FT by saying that the UK will ask for the single market of goods and the EU will say no, that won't help either. And it's not to say that the EU's wrong on these issues. I'm not saying the EU's position is necessarily the wrong position, but certainly it all fuels the perception that that the EU is behaving in a bullying kind of way. Just finally, just to respond to something John said, no deal is more and more likely, you said. I'm still a bit sceptical about that. Seems to me if it looked like, I think a breakdown in the talks is quite likely. People will say there's going to be no deal because the talks are broken down. But if the talks break down, there'll be such a lot of pressure from the financial markets on the British government to find a deal. And also there'll be pressure on the EU side to find a deal. Although the no deal is not catastrophic for the EU, it's quite bad for the EU. And Merkel and Macron, and indeed Juncker and Tusk have so much on their agenda, so many other crises. No deal would be a major issue for them. and would prevent them from dealing with migration, the Eurozone, Trump, Russia, Poland and Hungary, and whatever else they're worrying about. So I think if no deal comes back, then it looks likely then there'll be massive pressure for a deal, and if necessary, as you rightly say, John, to extend Article 50. I do think a breakdown is likely at some point, because how Mrs May satisfies her own cabinet, her own party in Parliament and the EU is very difficult to see, and she's got a rather difficult job, and she's going to try with the single market in goods plus customs union, and I think if it doesn't work at first, in the end Parliament will impose that, because it's the best sort of deal, or the only kind of deal that I think Parliament would probably live with, and we may see Parliament becoming a much more important actor. But I've spoken for long enough, and I'm happy to like to hear what other people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. It looks like we have almost 1 hour for the Q&A session, so I would like to open the floor for anyone who is interested in posing a question or a comment, but I would like you all to introduce yourself and state your affiliation. I know that most of us knows each other, but there are also people watching us, so it would be good for the transparency reason to do this.
Philip Stevens from the FT. Really just a little small addendum on what Charles said about what happens if a deal is rejected by Parliament. I mean, clearly Mrs May would have to go. You then have to have a leadership contest, which in the Tory party takes about 3 months. So you get back into you have to have a delay.
Could be less possibly.
Well, it's if you actually ask because of the requirements of a fair vote, it's quite hard to actually constitute. It's a sort of legal requirement as opposed to an administrative. But even if it's 2 months, you're talking. Then you have to assume that the Tory party would get a leader who could either push through Parliament the deal that Parliament has already rejected, or go to Brussels and negotiate another deal which Parliament would be accept. And I think you get into so many implausibilities there that the collapse into a general election becomes absolutely inevitable. If you think who the Tory party might elect as leader, that it will be someone who is reasonably hardline Eurosceptic. That will strengthen the Tory rebellion rather than weaken it, and if you like, make it harder. I mean, the reason that people who support the Boris Johnson position, that they don't want a leadership contest, is because they say it would be much harder to get our position through were Boris Johnson to be leader, or someone else, something of that ilk. So I think it's really hard to see a position where Parliament rejects a deal, where you don't have one, an extension, and two, a collapse into a general election, even though no one really wants a general, none of the Tories really want a general election.
We will cover 2 or 3 more questions, and then I will give an opportunity to our panelists to answer. There was Philip Suta, then you were next, and then Vernon Bogdanov also wanted to speak. So, after.
So Philip Suta from Clifford Chance. I want to ask, thinking about the meaningful vote amendment that is being looked at today, if it passes, does that make a hard Brexit more likely or a soft Brexit more likely? So the conventional wisdom seems to be that it makes a soft Brexit more likely because there's no majority for no deal. But looking at Danny Finkelstein this morning and various others who sort of opined on this, they seem to think that's not right. It makes a hard Brexit more likely because whilst there's a majority against there seems to be a majority against every possible thing, but there's no majority for a particular type of deal, and Parliament House of Commons might engage in a game of brinkmanship, which, if you take that to January, puts you in a scenario where there's quite a risk that you don't agree anything at all. So, grateful for thoughts on that.
This is Paul Rankin from HSBC. I'd like to ask a question about our negotiating partners, and that is Charles, you're right. It's my hunch too that the only realistic landing zone looks to be in this customs union, single market, and goods space. That actually that creates some quite interesting questions for the European side, which is really, is this too good a deal? Does this go too far down the direction of cherry picking, breaking up the indivisible four freedoms? Or is it actually for the European Union, I mean, a rather good deal, given kind of, you know, trade flows and so on and so forth? And you know, and crucially, you know, how likely is the EU 27 to remain unified if that is the point on the table? Because this is the point at which, you know, differential impact would be perhaps most starkly felt.
Okay, I will give the floor to Vernon, and we'll be grateful for brief comments slash questions.
Two brief comments for the team to discuss. The first is that the reason why public opinion hasn't changed significantly is that neither the government nor most members of the public have faced up to the fundamental dilemma of whether we seek alignment with the EU, which grew more than the customs union, as Turkey shows, actually means the internal market as well, or whether we seek divergence at the cost of great frictions to trade. And that dilemma will become much clearer in October and November. And it may well then be that the Conservatives realise it's in their interest. I agree with Charles' analysis of the Labour Party. The Conservatives appreciate it's in their interest to have a referendum so they don't own a really terrible Brexit. But my second comment is that whether Brexit can be stopped doesn't depend just on Britain, surely, but on the EU itself. And in particular on Angela Merkel and Macron, who are the leaders of liberal Europe, of which we're also a part. They won't want to lose a liberal country. And they might say that free movement is not a theology, and they might take notice of what Donald Tusk said after the referendum, that it's a wake-up call for Europe, which wants not more Europe, but better Europe, and make proposals for concrete improvements in areas that interest us, like energy, digital market and so on, so that the EU becomes more obviously an institution in which it's comfortable for Britain to remain. I think that's just as important as anything done on this side of the channel.
Thank you very much. Shall we perhaps start from John? Would you like to take any particular question or just respond to any of the comments? And that's also a chance to respond to Charles's comment and Hugo, because I think you've been called up several times.
Yeah, I'll take the easy ones. On Charles, I may have not made myself clear in what I said about the rising chance of no deal. That is not because anybody wants no deal. I quite agree with Charles that no deal is bad for everybody. It's bad for all 27 as well as us, although it's worse clearly for us. Nobody wants no deal. My point was simply that such is the negotiating deadlock inside the cabinet, inside the government, and between us and the European Union, that the risk that we end up with no deal is rising. It's no deal out of cock-up, not conspiracy, and I think the chance of it is quite high. On cherry picking, it's possible, and Charles is rarely wrong. It would be a paradoxical deal. We are a service economy, and we would, the Conservative Party is financed by the City of London. And the message to the City of London would be there's nothing in this for you, but for the 10-12% exports that are goods, good news, and no supply chain worries and so on. It's quite a difficult deal to sell domestically. I think a very difficult deal to sell in the 27. What is in it for the Poles? What is in it for the economies for whom free movement of persons is very important? The economies who wouldn't mind playing host to the industries that leave Britain because of supply chain problems and so on. So I don't think we can pick. I don't think we can look at it and say, we'd like to this and that. Boris has always said we can. Boris has been consistently wrong on every issue in this negotiation so far. But he could prove it's right this time. I find it quite hard to see. On Philip's question, Philip Souter's question about whether it's the meaningful vote, if the House of Lords amendment carries in the Commons today, makes it a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit more likely. My advice is that Danny Finkelstein is a brilliant writer, always worth reading, except on EU matters. Not a great expert on EU. I actually think it's neutral. I think that we know there is no majority for a hard Brexit in the House of Commons now, but we can't even protract that forward. We don't know whether that would be the case when the meaningful moment comes. So I'm afraid my answer is I don't know, and I don't think it goes either way. On Vernon's point, it's very rash to disagree with Vernon, and I don't disagree with Vernon. I do think, however, that when we start talking about the digital market and so on, or about how attitudes to free movement of persons may change, and I think that's true. Who knows what will be the effect of the Italian government? I think there's, I'm sure he didn't do this, but it's easy to elide into saying what our price should be for agreeing to take back the letter, call it all off, be the prodigal son. What do they have to do to persuade us to do that? That is an extraordinarily dangerous line to go down. It used to be argued by the more pro-European members of David Cameron's government that they used to say to people like me behind the hand, but they have to give him something. They have to give him something. And of course, possibly an element of truth. This is not the way it's going to go. We cannot be demandeur in this negotiation. We created this problem. They all hope we will change our minds, but they will not pay any price at all for us to change our mind, and nor should they. So I agree with what Vernon said, but if he had been going to take a little further, which I'm sure he wasn't, I would have disagreed.
Thank you very much. Shall I now turn to you,
Okay,
Hugo?
yes, just a couple of points of Charles's. I don't know if Vernon may be right that there's a chance that the Tories would propose a referendum. That's not what I'm counting on or working for as the most likely scenario. But I would take issue with one point, which is that I don't think it's true that the party only has a future if it delivers Brexit. If there is a people's vote and that decides that by a good majority that we should stay in the EU, that actually might be a huge godsend to the Conservative Party. Second thing is that I don't see Labour going out actively to promise a people's vote. That's not what I think's the most likely thing, but I think that it's quite possible that that's where they will be driven to by a process of elimination. If it's a bad deal, they'll vote against it. They won't want to crash out with no deal. They will want an election. Maybe they'll get one, maybe Philip's right, but maybe they won't get one. Maybe they'll want to go back and have more talks, but there won't be any time for more talks. What is the only thing that's left in those circumstances? A people's vote. I agree with what John just said about free movement, but I would add one point, which is that there is a lot that we can do within the existing EU rules on free movement, which David Cameron never did, and which we should exploit to the full. And we should also note that the Posted Workers Directive has already been modified, that Jeremy Corbyn used to rail against. This is, and if you're talking about Labour MPs who are concerned about free movement, we can build on these things. We can register EU citizens. We can do quite a lot of things that the Belgians do, etc., etc. Gordon Brown made a wonderful speech saying there are 6 things we could do without actually leaving the EU. The only thing I'd say about what Philip Stevens said is, yes, I think it's quite likely that if a deal is rejected, it might set off a chain reaction that leads to a general election. But you could go straight to a people's vote. When the deal comes back, Parliament could say, we don't like the look of it, we're going to ask the people. So rather than triggering a chaotic situation that leads to who knows what, the more rational thing would be, say, put it to the people. And the only thing I would say about this afternoon's vote, the other Philip, is that I think that if MPs don't back what peers voted for, that's when I think the crash out scenario becomes more realistic. And so, and we have to remember, I don't think Theresa May for one moment wants to crash out without a deal. But we do hear periodically stories about cabals of hardline Brexiters trying to get rid of her. Indeed, only about 10 days ago there was a story that as soon as, after the summit, as soon as this EU withdrawal bill was on the statute books, they put in their letters, they'd replace her with one of their number. I think that's going to be tricky, but anything's possible. And if they get one of their number in, if they get a Rees-Mogg or a Boris who says no deal is better than a bad deal and takes the talks right to the brink, they may think the EU's going to back down. They are living in a dream world. They don't know what's going on. And it is possible that we will have that accidental catastrophe.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Okay, just a couple of points. Minor point about what John Kerr just said. You're right, John, that if I'm right in saying what the British government's going to ask for, it's not great for the British economy. Single market in goods plus customs duty, not very good for our service industries. But to keep our services interested in the single market requires something close to Norway, and I don't see our political class or members of Parliament voting for free movement, large budget payments, and certain rule taking on for that. I mean, you said, John, that only manufacturing is only 10 or 12% of our exports. And of our economy, yes, of our exports, it's about half. So manufacturing is quite important for our exports. And the good thing about what I think the government's going to propose is it would be good for our manufacturing industry, and it would solve the Irish border issue. That's the key point about single market goods. Solve the Irish border issue combined with saving the VAT area and the customs union. It's not great for the economy overall, not great for the city, but you know we are where we are. Vernon, very interesting question about wouldn't Macron and Merkel try and keep us in? From my recent visits to Paris and Berlin, that it's not what anybody's thinking about or talking about. They've got so many other things on their plate, so many very serious problems to deal with that matter more to them than Brexit. And I didn't meet anybody close to Macron or Merkel who was sort of thinking, can't we make an effort to kind of make an offer on free movement or something. I know, Nick Clegg is somebody I respect hugely, but I think his piece in the FT 2 days ago was wrong. Nick thinks that there's a strong movement in continental countries to end free movement of labour within the EU. I know that some people in the Netherlands have told him that, and I've talked to some of the people who talked to Nick, but that's not mainstream thinking of the people who run the EU at the moment, or the French and German governments. It's those who are on the more populist side of politics may say that. Much bigger problem for most of these countries is immigration from outside the EU, not free movement from within it. And Nick says that the two are being conflated. Well, maybe they will be one day, but I don't think they're conflated yet. So I don't see any prospect of the EU offering us an emergency break on migration if we stay in. Although, as Hugo rightly said, and as Dennis McShane often says, there's a lot you can do within the EU rules to limit free movement of labour that hasn't, for some reason, David Cameron never tried to do. Finally, Paul Rankin's point, how the EU will respond to what I think is going to be Mrs May's proposals. Well, the initial response will certainly be no, because it is cherry picking, it's the integrity of the single market, it's the four freedoms have together, blah, 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 blah. And nobody in Paris or Berlin that I've spoken to recently is thinking about the economic consequences of Brexit. Nobody's saying, well, what can we do if we want to maximise trade investment? The economics is sort of irrelevant to most of the key decision makers in Paris, Berlin and Brussels. At the moment, will that change? I guess as we get into the negotiation of the future relationship, sectoral discussions, then sectoral interests will come to the fore, may start to have a little bit more influence. But I think the real answer to your question, Paul, is it depends on Britain's red lines. If Britain is prepared to soften its red lines, it might be difficult for the EU to reject the British plan completely. How much money will we pay into the budget or special fund for Central European development? What kind of indirect jurisdiction of the ECJ can we tolerate? How onerous will our restrictions on EU free movement be, and will they discriminate in favour of EU citizens or not? Those are the kind of questions. And if we can soften our red lines, then I think we will have allies. the trouble is, the more we soften the red lines, the greater the risk of some ministers resigning, and I do predict that some ministers will resign quite soon.
Thank you very much. We will now go for the second round of the questions. I have Lord Haney, I have the gentleman next to Lord Haney, and then John, and then we'll go for answers and go for another round because I have people lined up.
Well, I very seldom disagree with John, to such an extent that at the debate on Monday evening, Lord Callanan addressed me after I had spoken on an amendment which is not being voted as Lord Kerr, and I told him I was delighted to be thought so. But I do slightly disagree about the relative likelihood of no deal and a bad deal, because I think the only people who know how bad no deal is are sitting around a cabinet table. Some of them, like President Trump, don't read the papers and ignore them because they don't fit their views. But the ones, the adults around the table, amongst whom would have to include the Prime Minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lidington, and quite a few other people, do know how bad it is. So I believe that his scenario of a distress agreement is greater than the scenario of no agreement, because I think the British government will do everything it can to prevent no agreement, also because Parliament is going to reject it. So that's my point of disagreement. The point I would like to ask people to comment on is the content of the future relationship political agreement, which is to be negotiated if there is to be a deal. To what extent will that affect both Parliament and, if there's a people's vote, if it's just a great big parcel of fudge, which is what it's quite likely to be. If it's a great big parcel of fudge, which when it's disaggregated turns out to be nothing at all, and everyone will know that the UK outside negotiating during the transitional period for that will be in an even weaker position than we are now. Or will it have some specifics in it, in which case there are also great risks, of course. Although I tend to the view that the Brexiters basically are only interested in one thing, which is leaving on the 29th of March. And they will buy almost anything in order to achieve that. Then on Vernon and various other people about the outcome of a referendum and so on, I believe in the Peter Kellner school of thought, which says that when you poll people on a hypothetical, in an abstract situation, you get not terribly meaningful answers. You only get the meaningful answers when they know that on the X of March or May or whenever it may be, they're going to actually have to go into the voting booth and put an X against it, then you start to get that. So I think this is very unhelpful to the People's Vote movement, because a lot of MPs would have to vote for a referendum, even if they voted directly for a referendum in Hugo's thing, rather than going through an approval or disapproval process. They would still have to vote for legislation, and they seem to be all thinking that the polls can make up their mind for them. I don't think that's very wise. I don't think the polls will make up their minds for them. Anyway, I don't think they do. They will necessarily lead them in the right direction. Finally, I do think that our partners, the 27, had better start doing some contingency planning of a serious kind, not just on a no deal, but on any of the 7 or 8 options, because I think their bosses are going to ask them one day, sometime between now and Christmas, what do we do now? And that may be quite a difficult question to answer. And so it would be, since I don't subscribe to the Donald Trump school of soap opera diplomacy, I think it would be wiser if somebody in all those 27 capitals and in Brussels gave some thought to that.
Thank you very much. Please.
Dick to Vernon, Lib Dem here. Just 3 minor comments. One is, I think we could change the atmosphere to some extent if it wasn't for the fact that one of the major obstacles we face at the moment is that everyone thinks that we're going to leave. This is encouraged by the statements of dissidents. Even Philip Lee today was saying, of course, I will support the verdict and we are going to leave. Green has said much the same thing. Kerr positively says, of course, we're going to leave. Now that creates a climate of acceptance that we're leaving, which is not helpful to our case. And I don't understand why they keep doing that. They don't have to say immediately we're going to leave. You have to say, look, we want another vote because the facts have changed. Yes, of course we respect the verdict of the people, but this is not what they actually voted for. And I think that's a perfectly feasible retreat. And every time they say, of course we're going to leave, that if there is a referendum, it will be held against them because they have constantly repeated something which is now a contradiction to. Second, I would have thought it was that one of the dangers I see if there is a people's vote is it's all the fault of Brussels. Brussels is trying to punish us. Now I do think if that is the argument forward, one could have some help from a really clear statement by the 27 that we very much regret your leaving. We want you to stay. But it's very difficult to say that if all the leading countries assure us that they want us to stay, it rather contradicts the idea that all they're concerned about is to punish us. And a third minor point on public opinion. I believe that one of the things which may be helpful is that there is a change of mood about immigration. There was an article in the Observer about the other day, a few weeks ago, saying that there's nothing like the hostility to immigration that people imagine. And there are a certain number of factors in favour. The Windrush case has really meant sort of public mood that, God, my God, we have treated these immigrants badly. And there's, I think, an even greater scandal about the burst, which I put in letters in the Guardian. The way in which the sort of people we need, the highly skilled and not quite highly paid immigrants, are being treated because a minor mistake in tax returns is being treated as if it's an act of high treason. These people are teachers, doctors, any number of people who've contributed a great deal to this country have made a minor mistake which the revenue accepts was not deliberate and was not dishonesty, and are now deprived of their livelihood. They can't access the health service. Their prospect at the moment is either deportation to countries with which most of them have no longer have any links, the deportation to these countries, or to beg and put their families on the streets. Now, we could work that into a tremendous sense of national injustice, a huge scandal. This is all the way in which we can change attitudes to immigration, which is quite an important part of public opinion. So, I think there are several other things. I mean, most people have made this point, but it does seem as if the motor car manufacturers are beginning to speak out, and that could have a very considerable influence on the Labour vote. So, I'm an optimist, or rather sort of moderate pessimist. I think there's, first of all, a very good chance of being no deal. I do not see how the Irish problem will be settled. Unless complete surrender, and I don't quite see the Conservative government or the party accepting that and able to make that gesture of humiliation. And secondly, I think that most of the news about most of the news about Brexit is going to be bad news, and I would have thought it would have some effect on public opinion as well.
Thank you very much. I still have John, and then we'll give the panelists opportunity to answer. Then I know there are other people. And also, if there are colleagues in the last rows, then definitely, yes, please raise your hand so that I can see you.
Yes, John Peake from The Economist. I'll try to be fairly brief. I mean, I think I'm with Charles. I think the chances of reversing Brexit are still quite small, notwithstanding the idea that it would be very desirable. But I'm also with Lord Hanley, and to some extent what Victor Byrne just said, in thinking that a bad deal is the most likely outcome, rather on the lines of Charles suggested in the his FT piece, because what's really emerged in the last few weeks is a recognition, contrary to what Mrs. May used to say, that a bad deal is better than no deal. And I think that is what the parliamentary shenanigans are really. That is what the parliamentary shenanigans are really about. But what I wanted to ask was perhaps not of the panel, but of Douglas Alexander, a bit more about Labour, because I was very interested in what happened about the debate about the EEA last week, and a substantial number of Labour MPs were very keen to support the EEA amendment. Only really Caroline Flint and Kate Herring spoke out strongly against it, and I agree that the trade unions are more interested in an EEA-type solution. And of course the EEA solution, notwithstanding the problem of free movement, but you could deal with that through Hugo's line, or possibly the emergency break in the EEA treaty, the EEA solution has a great merit that you could adopt it almost immediately. So if there is a crisis and you're trying to avert no deal, EEA is a possible outcome. But to get there clearly requires Labour to endorse the EEA, and I just wondered if there's a chance of moving in that direction.
Shall we, before we give the floor to panel, shall we give an opportunity to Douglas Alexander to comment on?
Speak out some people at the back.
Yes,
Yeah.
very hard to hear at the back,
What's-
Douglas.
Yes, I make no claim to speak on foreign affairs for today's Labour Party. I should probably add that as a qualification at the beginning. But trying to assess dispassionately where we are, I think one of the paradoxes that we haven't drawn out in this conversation is that the Conservative rebels are desperate for a referendum and desperate to avoid a general election, while the Labour leadership is desperate for a general election and is desperate to avoid a referendum. And how that tension is reconciled will dictate whether there is a second vote or indeed the possibility of a referendum. I think it's important to add some perspective from where Labour MPs see this. First of all, one of the learnings out of last year's general election is that Europe matters less to a significant portion of the electorate than many of us in this room might wish so. Whether that's a fair judgment or not, that's part of the common sense that has been drawn out of last year's general election. Secondly, exactly as Charles says, present Labour leadership themselves have very clear views in relation to European cooperation, in relation to their vision of socialism. But also, there is a widespread sense that Labour did well electorally by talking about anything other than Brexit at the last general election. The claim being that if a second vote or Europe generally had been the centrepiece of Labour's election manifesto last year, it is unlikely that Labour would simultaneously be winning seats like Sunderland and winning seats like Canterbury and Kensington. And that's because, exactly as Charles suggests, there is a potential fracture that runs through the only coalition that Labour historically has been able to put together to win a majority, which is the issue of immigration. When you see a Labour voter in Hampstead holding a Refugees Welcome poster, you don't often see that in, let's say, Sunderland, where there was a very significant Leave vote registered. And the Labour leadership made a judgment therefore that A, it wasn't as salient an issue as many people thought, and B, there was no benefit in relitigating the argument of the referendum in circumstances in which it would fracture rather than cohere Labour support. So in that sense, I think if you look at the EEA vote, there are a whole number of Labour MPs who regard immigration and free movement as having been central to the judgment that people made in the referendum. And I broadly think when you think of the language of take back control, that spoke to both a sovereignty cohort of voters, often former Conservative and UKIP voters, for whom it was code for British judges adjudicating British laws in British courts made by British politicians, but it was also code for take back control of our borders for a lot of former Labour voters. And that is a sentiment that is widely understood amongst a number of those Labour colleagues. So in that sense, I think the scenario that we're looking at the moment, I struggle to anticipate Hugo's scenario whereby the Labour leadership move off the position of they perceive constructive ambiguity anytime soon. Ironically, to bring in a point that was made earlier, I think the one issue that is big enough is the issue of free movement and immigration. And if and I fully accept what you say, John, in terms of the unlikelihood of this. But if there was, say, an initiative by Macron to say there is a case for EU-wide reform of free movement of labour, not a special dispensation or further guarantees for the UK, but in our own interest, the EU27 think we need to move on this, that is the single biggest issue that can get those MPs off the hook on which they feel they're impaled at the moment. And in that sense, if you could construct a scenario whereby there was a supervening event, for example, movement on free movement, then I think that's possible. I simply don't accept the argument that says, at the moment, most of those Labour MPs or Labour voters believe so many new facts have emerged that they feel obliged to move their position. And in that sense, one fact that could change would be a significant initiative in relation to free movement. The final point is just on the political declaration that you mentioned. My concern, I have to say, as someone who's passionate in support of Remain, is that it will be such a fudgy document, it will actually allow Conservative rebels to say we've got enough that we need, and will allow everybody to project onto the fudgy 60 to 80 page political declaration what they need to hear to allow them to vote for the withdrawal agreement. And in that sense, I think how that political declaration is interpreted is actually going to be fundamental to what happens in Parliament in the late autumn and early months of next year.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, can I ask you for brief comments?
Nothing from me. I want to let other people ask questions. So.
John? Hugo?
Yeah, thank you. It's quite right in the House of Lords. Handy and Kerr are seen as exactly the one person. He has the brain. I occasionally use the brain. I believe that it will be not 60 to 80 pages of fudge. I think it'll be about 15 to 20 pages maximum of fudge. And I think it'll be only fudge. And I give credit to David Davis for not wanting that. I think David Davis understands how, when we are no longer members of the European Union, our negotiating leverage will be even lower than it is now, when we're just behaving as if we were no longer members, but we are actually still entitled to attend meetings. Now, I believe that he will lose, that the Gove School, which basically has swallowed it all, because at least we get out, will win. So I am in favour of I'm not in favour, I believe the likelihood is a pure fudge, and not a document that really affects the serious negotiation which then has to start. I'm very disappointed by it. On Dick's point, yes, I entirely agree that the Daily Mail is going to have tremendous fun with what are they, the 27, doing, messing around with our Brexit. Why don't they just shut up and take whatever we're going to give them? I think Brussels punishing us will be a big thing. I agree with that. How to counteract that? I think that it is the case that the declarations Dick is asking for are all out there. Everyone has said they would rather we stay. Everybody has said. But I would be nervous, Dick, about asking them all to get together and say formally and collectively, oh, please don't stay and please don't go. It seems to me that that looks a bit stagey and implausible. I'm not sure I favour that. The document they have all agreed is the April 2017 guidelines to bargaining, which says in terms that if the UK changes its mind on any of its 4 red lines, then we would be prepared to look again at all this and see if we could do something better. That is still their formal position. So, if one was to get to Charles's predicted scenario, we are going to have to shift quite a lot on red lines. And at present, that seems to be very difficult for the Prime Minister to openly acknowledge. That's, I think, the principal reason why I'm not so sure as Charles about the plausibility of that. On Douglas's scenario, yes, I agree it would be wonderful if there was a general declaration of the 27 or the 28, we're still in the club, that it's important to look again at the principle of free movement of labour. This is never going to happen. David Cameron's great mistake was to attack the principle instead of saying, I intend in future to apply it the way you, Belgium, do, and you, Denmark, do, and you, Sweden, do. The posted workers point, Hugo's point, is a very big point, actually. Gordon Brown's 6 points, all things we can do as members of the European Union. Very big points. But the idea that they would present us with a rethink, which would require amending the treaty, which nobody wants to do, I'm afraid that simply won't happen.
Thank you very much. Hugo?
Yes,
Can I ask you
yes,
to
yes.
be brief?
I have a slight difference with both David and John on the fudge question. I agree that the political declaration will be fudge, but I think the withdrawal agreement, by way of the backstop, may go into excruciating detail. And if the UK's position prevails, which is that the backstop must apply to the whole UK, not just to Northern Ireland, and if the EU's position prevails, which is that the backstop must not have a deadline on it, then the backstop will be an indefinite, highly detailed agreement on customs and regulation covering the whole UK. And that will prevail for God knows how long. That will be effectively the customs economic deal for the time being.
Thank you.
You need the DUP on.
I have
No, you
five.
don't. But no, if it covers the whole of the UK, they've said their only red line is that Northern Ireland must not be treated differently from Great Britain.
Okay.
Could
I still
could
have.
I have a last
Can-
one on
I think I need to be very stringent and brutal because we have 20 minutes left and I still have 5 or 6 actually people lined up. So Martin, and then there was Thurburn, Tanya, did I miss someone?
Nick.
Gentleman in the
Nick.
back and Nick, yes, I have Nick on my list. And please be
Stephen
brief.
Castle.
And Martin.
Thank you. Martin Sandler from the Financial Times. I'll be brief because my question has been half addressed already. I'm glad that we finally got to distinguish between the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship. There are really 2 deals here, and we're talking about no deal, bad deal, acceptable deal. It's bad to fall into the trap that we fall into so often and not distinguish between. You've already begun to address this, so let me just put what was going to be the second half of my question. Might it not turn out that agreeing on the backstop, which, if the political declaration is pure fudge, will be the operational deal to be voted on? If it becomes so difficult to agree on the backstop as it looks now, I certainly don't think the UK will prevail with its all UK demand. What are the prospects of that sufficiently concentrating minds in the government that they would speed up the work to actually agree on what future relationship they want to have? Because that is really the only solution to the backstop dilemma, is to actually commit to something one way or the other on the future relationship.
Thank you very much.
Just start by saying I'm Torbjörn Scholten, Swedish ambassador to the UK, for those of you who don't know me. Fascinating discussion. A lot of things that one would perhaps like to comment on, but I think I will refrain from going too far into what the EU27 thinks about the various options that you have discussed. I think John's and Charles's characterization of the EU27's position, I think, is a fair one and realistic. I'll limit to that. But on the question of what the EU27, what the EU27 have said about UK changing its mind, I think every single member state have repeatedly said that we very much regret the British decision. There is a statement by the President of the European Council that is difficult to interpret in any other way than him saying it would be a welcome thing if the UK changed its mind, even if he expressed that in different words. And I think it would be unrealistic to expect the 27 to say anything formal, more formal in this direction. My question is a different one. It goes to Hugo Dixon. In terms of your opinion numbers, You say it's going to be very, very important for your task to get a more significant change in public opinion. And I was wondering if you could say some words about where you think such a change of opinion is possible. Which part of the British electorate do you think could be amenable to changing their mind?
Thank you very much, Tanya.
Full support for the Swedish ambassador. I'm Tanya von Uslar, I'm German chargé. I just wanted to make one comment and one question. The comment is full support to Charles on the free movement question. And I just wanted to highlight it is considered to be one of the great achievements of the European Union. And looking at it from a purely German perspective, we're in a huge migration crisis internally at the moment. Not one word is spoken about free movement of people from within the European Union. When we talk about 1.1 million refugees, it's all external migration to Germany. I think we have a net migration from the EU around 400,000 a year, and we need them. We have a desperate shortage of qualified and skilled labour. We have full employment, as does Britain, which still has a net migration beyond 100,000 per year. So looking at it from a purely economic point of view, it would be contrary to our interests to go against movement of labour from within the European Union, and it would not be supported by public opinion either, which does not mean that we will not, and many countries have done so, as social policy is a national policy, not go against excess and unjust use of our social systems. That's two totally different issues. My question is, and as the Swedish ambassador has said, all EU countries have said we regret Britain leaving, we want Britain to stay, and nothing would make me personally happier than if a second referendum would yield a different result. However, could those who so passionately advocate this tell us in the EU 27 what kind of Britain would we be getting when we come back? What would be Britain's position with such a strong, then in that case minority, wanting Britain out of the European Union? What would be the British role in the EU after a happy remain?
Thank you very much. There was gentleman at the back, and then Stephen. Yes, sorry.
Charles Aldington, nobody in particular. I have two very quick ones. One of them would be Douglas, it seems to me that if the Labour Party are in election, then they will face up the question as to whether they want the Brexit situation to be still open the other side of the election. And that means deciding in their election campaign whether they're going to be neutral or whether they're going to be, say, stop Brexit. And so, in other words, the question whether having an election actually helps the Labour Party is particularly issue. So that's the other thing is completely unrelated. We have, unusual in a London conversation, we have devoted a lot of time to talking about how the 27 might react. And somebody, I think John said that there's a risk of Versailles behaviour amongst the 27. I think they would be totally petrified at the effect amongst their own smaller members being seen to be a big-time bully towards us. I may be entirely wrong, but I think that when that penny drops somewhere towards the end of this year, is it not possible that then causes the EU 27 or Brussels to say, we've got to maybe take some measures ourselves
Thank you very much. I still have Stephen and then Nick. Could you be brief, please? And that was Charles Aldington, Chairman of the Introverts. Steve. But you have to speak up because
could you stand up or we can't hear you? Please stand.
Very so very tantalising perspective.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you for being patient.
And on Tory, I'll be reasonably quick. Sorry, Nick Greenstock from Gatehouse. Talking with a kind of the supporting institutions within the UK behind the cabinet. There's much more talk now about the conversations with their European and particularly Commission counterparties in this negotiation about the differentiation between the EU and Europe and the way in which the UK can be part of Europe, but not necessarily part of the EU in its existing form. And the second part of that separation is around the Commission as the negotiating partner as opposed to the EU 27. And the elements of punishment seem to be coming from those who are vested in the perpetuation of the existing form of that institution. So a difficult negotiating partnership here when we begin to separate out who is driving that piece forward, Council or Commission.
Thank you very much. If this is very brief, then you have, no, okay, well then maybe after the event. I think there are some questions directed individually to Hugo, from Tanya and from Tjörn, and perhaps Charles and John, but very briefly if you would like to come on, to come.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah,
okay.
I think you have three
yes.
questions.
So Torbjörn, is that right?
Torbjörn.
Torbjörn. Yes, I think that the change in public opinion that we've had so far seems, in our favour, seems to have been about, well, half of it actually is not a change in public opinion, it's just demographic change. Older people, unfortunately, tend to be more leave, and some of them have died. Younger people tend to be more remain, and some of them have come into voting age. The second, and it's about 1 percentage point a year, is that factor. The second thing is the second change, which is about half of the change, perhaps slightly more than the change, is almost entirely Labour Leave voters becoming pro-European. So the Tory Leave voters haven't shifted at all, but the Labour has shifted. About a quarter of the Labour Leave seems to have changed their mind. Now that is important because to get the most realistic way of getting a people's vote is if we get the whole Labour Party to back us. We do not need the whole Tory party, we only need 10 or 20 Tory MPs. But if we get another shift among those Labour Leave voters who are increasingly seeing this as a Tory project that is going to lead to more austerity, they don't believe this nonsense about a Brexit dividend for the NHS, or very few of them believe that anymore, there is a chance. What we need, I think, are two more things to have a big shift. One is the whole Gordon Brown agenda about we can tighten up on the application of free movement without abandoning the principle. And the second is we have to have a positive vision, not a positive vision so much for the EU, but a positive vision for our own country, how we are going to get a fairer society, how we are going to build a better future for young people, how power is going to be closer to the people. So not just Project Fear. That was the problem last time with David Cameron. There was nothing positive for people who felt that their lives were not going well. So we need that positive. Now, if you have that, you can perhaps swing another chunk of Labour, and then Bob's your uncle. What kind of Britain will you be getting? Well, the other positive vision that we do need is which isn't so much about changing public opinion, although there's a bit of it there, but it's a positive vision for Britain's role in the EU. And the main element of that, in my view, is that we understand the EU's value as a geopolitical actor. In the past, we thought it was all about money. Now, with Putin, with Trump, with Xi in Beijing, with tens of millions of people on the move in Africa and Asia, we understand that our role is going to be more powerful by sticking with like-minded neighbours who are either smaller than us or roughly the same size, with whom we can have a partnership of equals, and we can make common cause with you to grasp the opportunities and fight the challenges of the 21st century. And that is the new arrangement, the new basis for a new, healthy, positive relationship, which you should grasp with both hands, both feet, and both ears.
Thank you.
All my heart, yes.
Thank you very much. There was a question from Stephen to Charles. Can Theresa May survive?
Yeah, I have three questions. Stephen, I think at least I believe Liam Fox, David Davis and Boris Johnson are unenthusiastic about the moves towards staying in the single market for goods, because if you do that you have to adopt all the EU regulations on goods combined with de facto staying in a customs union for a very long time until some high-tech solution is workable, would mean Britain could not do free trade agreements with other countries for a very, very long time. So if I was Boris or Liam or David, I would be a little bit unconcerned. So if I was looking to ministers who might not like the direction of travel of the government, who might question their positions, it would be those ones. There are a couple of other questions. The unity of the 27, which is an earlier question from Paul I didn't answer and somebody else asked it again. I've been surprised how united the 27 have been on Brexit. I mean, we all knew that the French and the Germans and the Commission would drive the process. We all know that they are, particularly Paris and Berlin, taking a tough line on the British for many reasons, but one is the fact that they want to demonstrate that leaving the EU is a bad idea. And I certainly got this, I was recently in Paris from people around Macron. He's scared of the European elections. He's worried about the European elections in less than a year, that Mrs. Le Pen might do quite well, that the Eurosceptics might do well in the European Parliament as a whole and be the biggest bloc. That would be a humiliation for Macron. One, therefore, very important to demonstrate to French voters that Brexit has strong negative consequences. Now, the question is, will some of the smaller countries, somebody asked, kind of rise up and stop this Franco-German dominated process? Well, it's not happening at the moment. I'm not sure if it will happen. I think both John, Pete and I have expected it to happen sooner than it has happened. It hasn't really happened yet because the other countries basically agree with the French and the Germans on many of the substantial issues that the level playing field is important, that the four freedoms are indivisible. As we get into sectoral discussions on particular issues, maybe that will change a bit and industrial interests and particular economic interests will come to the fore, but we haven't seen it yet. I personally hope that we go for a Brexit that doesn't ignore the economics, but so far economics is being ignored. Last question, the Labour Party going into the next general election. I think their line, Corbyn's line will be, we want a softer Brexit than the Tories. He's not going to say we want to end Brexit or stop Brexit. The problem for Corbyn is that if Mrs May, if I'm right that Mrs May is going to go for a softer Brexit involving the single market for goods and the customs union, then it's harder for Corbyn to stay on the EU side of that without going down the free movement path, which as Douglas, who's now gone, said is not popular with a lot of Labour MPs in the North and the Midlands. So difficult for Corbyn, but I don't think he's going to go into the election promising a second referendum, sadly. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you very much. John?
I think that actually the People's Vote referendum is very attractive to Corbyn, and I think it will become the position of the Labour Party. I know Douglas Alexander was saying something quite different. He knows much more about it than me, and I'm a crossbencher, not a Labour Party. But I'm very old, and I remember Harold Wilson 75. For Harold Wilson 75, it was very good to sit up the mountain and see fair play, and allow people like Dick Severn and Roy Jenkins and Dennis Healey to do the spade work on one side of the debate, and people like Peter Shaw and Anthony Redruth Ben to do the spade work on the other side of the debate. The Prime Minister, though he'd had a renegotiation, sort of, he was not actively campaigning. He was seeing fair play. Now for the Labour Party, two propositions are bound to be Labour Party policy. One is that, my God, the Tories have made a mess of it. That all oppositions say that. This time, possibly it's true. Secondly, it's not what the people were told to expect. That proposition is clearly true too. Proposition 3, so maybe we'd better ask the people. For the People's Party, that's not a bad position to be in. So it seems to me we're quite likely to see that become Labour policy within 6 months' time. On the question of whether you get a sophisticated backstop involving the whole campaign, which so turns into part of the second negotiation, or rather replacing part of the second negotiation, because it's there. I just find it really very difficult. I agree that the Borises, I agree with Charles, the Borises are going to find that very hard to swallow. It seems to me that she has kicked a lot of cans down a lot of roads in order to avoid taking on that side of the party. She hasn't got much time left. This would be a far bigger reversal than buying the money and the rigged citizens' rights, the interim period and the ECJ and the interim period and the original buying, the sequencing and all that. This would be a much bigger reversal. And she tries to avoid these things, so it seems to me it's a bit unlikely.
Thank you very much for the stimulating discussion. My perhaps 2 or 3 takeaways from the discussion we had. First of all, if there is anything positive about this exercise, it is that Parliament is actually becoming more assertive and has been challenging the government, something which we thought would be impossible 2 years ago. We still need Labour to get its act together, and if there is any party which should support perhaps another vote, that should be People's Party. And perhaps 2 cents from me. I have an impression that the discussion about the meaningful vote and all the scenario is taking place slightly in isolation of what Brussels would say and how it would respond to any request to extend the negotiations or to actually withdraw the notification. So my suggestion would be we organise another roundtable very soon and discuss what the EU27 would think and say about that. Thank you very much.